She walked into his house with the storm at her back, and a past she wouldn't name. She didn't come for love, only a name, and a place no man could claim her again. He didn't offer comfort, just a roof, a contract, and a silence thick with old grief. But when her past came knocking with threats and cold demands, Elias Roland found he was willing to fight, not because she was his by law, but because she was hers by choice. If you believe no one should ever be treated as property, stay with us. The wind came down from the ridgeline like it had a grudge against every living thing. It howled across the brittle grass and rattled the shingles already loose on the Roland house. Inside, Elias stood in the dark parlor with his hand pressed flat to the window pane. The cold seeped through the glass and into the bones of his wrist, as if reminding him that winter could still take whatever was left. In the yard, the last fence post leaned to the side, surrendering to the wind the way he'd surrendered to loss. He hadn't planned on surviving Martha by 3 years, hadn't planned on watching the land they'd built together become a ledger of debts and past due notices. He traced the shape of a crack in the glass and tried to remember the sound of her laughter, but even memory had grown thin and tattered. Most days, he forgot to light the stove until the cold made his hands ache. Nights he sat at the kitchen table staring at the ledger, the numbers dancing like crows on a carcass. The ranch had never been prosperous, but it had been honest. A man could look at a herd of cattle and know the value of his labor. Now the pens were empty, the grass gone to seed, and the barn roof sagged like an old dog's back. Elias wondered if the house itself was waiting for him to die, so it could fall without guilt. He pressed his other palm to the window as if holding the storm at bay. The wind only howled louder, slamming against the door. He didn't flinch. He had nothing left to fear. That was the cruel freedom of sorrow. It stripped a man down to the bone, left him with no illusions to shelter under. A gust tore past the corner of the house, driving sleet against the glass. Through the swirling white, he saw a lantern bobbing up the road, weaving like a star, losing its place in the sky. For a moment he thought it was some memory come to taunt him. Martha returning across the snow with her hands full of hope. But the shape behind the light was too tall, too broad-shouldered. A horse, breath streaming in pale clouds, pulled up near the porch. The rider dismounted stiffly, favoring one knee. When the lantern lifted, it caught the face of Pastor Morton, pale, lined, and solemn even in good weather. Elias closed his eyes. He knew what this visit meant. No one came up that hill in a storm unless they meant to collect a debt or deliver bad news. The boards creaked under the pastor's boots. A measured knock, polite even in urgency. Elias didn't move. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if the old man feared the wind would carry his message away before it landed. At last, Elias stepped back from the glass. His reflection wavered there, hollow-eyed, hair shot through with gray, mouth set in the line of a man who had buried too much to grieve out loud. He opened the door, and the wind rushed in like a living thing, clutching at his coat and the papers on the side table. "Evening, Elias." Pastor Morton's voice was steady, though the lantern shook in his grip. "I'm sorry to trouble you." Elias stepped aside, not trusting himself to speak. He watched the pastor cross the threshold and set the lantern on the table, its light spreading over Martha's old ledger, the unopened letters, the wooden box that held her wedding ring. For a moment, neither man said anything. The wind banged the door against the frame. Elias closed it with a soft click, sealing them inside the hush. "I won't pretend this is easy," Pastor Morton began, voice low. "But you have a decision to make, one that won't wait on better weather." Elias leaned against the wall. He felt the cold still clinging to the pastor's coat, smelled the wet wool and lamp oil. "If you've come for the note, you'll have to wait until the thaw." "It's not the note." Morton's eyes flicked to the ledger. "Though the bank is pressing harder." Elias looked down, tracing a groove in the floorboards with the toe of his boot. "Then, say it plain." "There's a woman in town," Morton said. "Marabel Quinn, a quiet sort. She needs a place. And you need a way to keep this land." The words fell like stones in the silence. Elias lifted his gaze. The pastor met it evenly, though a flicker of pity moved across his lined face. Outside, the wind keened against the eaves, as if the storm itself had opinions on bargains made in desperation. The lantern hissed as a draft slipped under the door, the flame trembling in its glass prison. Elias held his breath, as if any sound he made might shatter the fragile peace between them. Pastor Morton set his hat on the table and folded his hands over it, a gesture that looked almost like prayer. "She's a widow herself," the pastor said softly. "Her husband passed 3 years ago. Consumption, they say. She has no kin willing to claim her, save a cousin who's less than honorable." Elias said nothing. He studied the floorboards, the knots worn smooth by years of boots pacing in worry. The wood knew the shape of his grief. It knew the weight of his debt. "Her dowry," Morton continued, voice measured, "would be enough to clear your note with the bank and put seed in the ground come spring." Outside, the storm threw another handful of sleet against the window. The noise was like bones rattling in a tin pail. Elias shut his eyes. He thought of Martha, of how she'd stood in this very room with her hair still damp from rain, telling him that love was something you chose every day, not something you waited to feel. He had believed her then, believed that no matter what the world took from them, they could stand together in the wreckage. But Martha was gone, and the wreckage had swallowed everything else. "What does she want in return?" he asked finally, voice stripped bare. Pastor Morton's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. "A place, a name, a measure of safety." He paused. "She's not a burden, Elias. She's a woman trying to keep her dignity in a place that doesn't always allow it." The wind pressed against the house in a long, low moan as if agreeing. Elias drew in a slow breath. "I won't force your hand," Morton said. "But the truth is, if you don't find a way to satisfy the bank, they'll take this land before the thaw. You know that." Elias did know. He felt the truth of it in his bones, as inevitable as winter. "What sort of woman agrees to marry a stranger?" he muttered, more to himself than to the pastor. "A woman with fewer choices than you," Morton said quietly. Silence fell between them, heavy and alive. Elias turned his head and looked at the ledger again. The numbers blurred, then sharpened. He saw the shape of his own failure etched there in ink. Pastor Morton reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "She's waiting at the church. If you choose to accept, we can have the papers witnessed tonight, before the storm worsens." Elias took the paper but did not open it. He felt the edges cutting into his palm like a judgment. And then, as if conjured by the naming of her, the door creaked. A shape moved in the threshold. Slender, wrapped in a brown traveling cloak that reached the floor. The lantern light caught the hem, showing a line of damp edging up the wool. She lifted her face, pale and oval as a winter moon. Her eyes were large, the color of a still pond, and they did not quite meet his. She looked instead past his shoulder, to some point in the dark he could not see. Her hands moved then, fluttering up to smooth the collar of her cloak, then folding tightly together at her waist. She did not speak. "Marabel Quinn," Pastor Morton said gently. "This is Elias Roland." Elias inclined his head, unsure what courtesy remained in such a transaction. She did not nod in return, only stood there, eyes fixed on that invisible place beyond him. A quiet, as deep as the hush before snowfall, settled over the room. The storm still raged, but it seemed far away now, pressed behind thick walls and thicker silence. Pastor Morton cleared his throat. "I can give you both a moment if you wish." Elias looked at the woman, at her fine-boned face, the way her breath fogged in the lantern light. He thought of the cattle lost to hunger, of the way Martha's ring still waited in its box, of the ledger that would not forgive him. He thought, too, of what it meant to be so alone that you'd rather bind yourself to a stranger than face the dark without a name to anchor you. "No need," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "We'll sign." Marabel did not startle, did not lift her gaze. She only nodded once, small and solemn, as if she'd already known this ending was coming. Pastor Morton set the papers on the table, weighing them down with the lantern so they wouldn't flutter away. The storm beat its fists against the house. They did not flinch. The ceremony itself took no more than 15 minutes. They signed their names where the pastor's finger pointed, the ink pooling in small black moons against the paper. Marabel's hand did not tremble as she wrote, though Elias noticed she held the pen too tightly, as if it were the last solid thing in her grasp. When she finished, she folded her hands again, pressing them flat to the table like she needed to feel its reality beneath her skin. Pastor Morton read the vows aloud. His voice was solemn, But Elias heard a sorrow threaded through the words, a lament for what marriage had become when survival demanded it. He repeated each line as required, tasting the bitterness behind them. Marabel did not echo the pastor. She only lifted her chin and nodded once when he paused, her pale throat moving as she swallowed whatever thoughts she could not give voice to. When it was done, the pastor cleared his throat and closed the ledger with a soft, reverent motion. The sound was final, like the closing of a casket. He offered them a benediction, though Elias was not sure either of them believed the words would carry past the roof, much less to any god who might be listening. Marabel turned then, as if to take in the room at last. Her gaze drifted over the worn curtains, the cold stove, the empty rocking chair by the hearth. She did not linger on any of it. Instead, she studied the shadows pooled in the corners, the places where the lantern's light could not quite reach. Elias watched her take it all in, and he wondered what she saw, whether she measured the poverty of the place or the poverty of its master. The wind battered the walls again, rattling the window panes like bones in a tin cup. Marabel did not startle. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded neatly, her eyes distant. "You'll want to start the stove," Pastor Morton said, his voice softer now. "She's been traveling since dawn. The cold takes hold quickest when you're tired." Elias felt the rebuke under the kindness. He turned without answering and moved to the hearth. The logs lay in a careless pile, gray with old ash. He knelt and set about arranging them, feeling the weight of her gaze on his back, or perhaps only imagining it. He struck the match and the flame flared, bright and small. In that moment he thought how easy it would be to let it gutter out, how tempting it was to sit in the dark and pretend none of this was happening. But the cold would not spare them just because they refused to meet it. So he coaxed the fire to life, feeding it small splinters until it began to burn in earnest. The light flickered against the walls, casting their shadows long and wavering. When he stood, Marabel was watching the fire, her expression unreadable. He wondered again if she heard the storm at all, if she could sense the crack and roar of it through the floorboards. Before he could ask, Pastor Morton laid a hand on his shoulder. "I'll leave you to settle in," the pastor said, voice roughened by fatigue and some gentler emotion Elias couldn't name. "The Lord be with you both." Elias inclined his head. Marabel did not respond, did not even turn. Her eyes stayed fixed on the flames as if they were speaking to her in a language he could never learn. When the door closed behind the pastor, the quiet that followed was immense. The wind shrieked around the eaves, but inside the walls there was only the hush of breathing and the small, determined crackle of the fire. For a long time, neither of them moved. Elias studied her in the flickering light, noting the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her mouth settled into a shape that was not quite sadness, but not peace either. He opened his mouth to speak, to say what, he didn't know. But she turned before the words found their shape. She bent to her small trunk and lifted it with careful precision, as though she feared even the act of setting her possessions down would offend the house. Without looking at him, she carried it toward the narrow hallway that led to the back rooms. Her skirts whispered over the boards, a sound as soft and private as a sigh. Elias watched her disappear into the dark. When the latch clicked behind her, he released the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The fire snapped, sending a bright spark up the chimney. For an instant he imagined he heard Martha's voice, a single word he could not catch, lost in the hush. Marabel did not emerge again that night. Elias sat by the fire until the logs collapsed into a heap of embers, the orange glow painting the walls with shapes that looked almost like company. He waited, telling himself she would come out for warmth or water, but the door to the small room at the end of the hall stayed closed. At last, when the chill began to creep back through the floorboards, he banked the coals and climbed the narrow stairs to the loft. Sleep did not come easily. He lay on the edge of the mattress, one arm flung across the empty space where Martha had once slept. It was strange how quickly a body could forget the warmth of another. He stared up at the beams, tracing each knothole in the dark, until dawn seeped in through the cracks around the shutters. When he finally rose, the house felt hollow in a new way, not just empty, but occupied by a presence too quiet to be company. He found her in the kitchen, standing beside the table with her hands clasped in front of her. She'd taken off her cloak and now wore a simple gray dress, the fabric worn soft at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a knot so precise it looked almost severe. She did not look up when he entered. Instead, she tilted her head, as if listening for something only she could hear. It was then, watching her face in profile, that he began to suspect what he'd failed to see the night before. The stillness, the way she never startled at the banging of the shutters, the way she had not responded to Pastor Morton's benediction, or his own small attempts at speech. "Marabel," he said quietly. She didn't stir. He took a step closer and tried again, louder. "Marabel." Nothing. She was no more aware of his voice than she had been of the wind screaming at the eaves. He drew in a slow breath. Part of him felt a dull shame for not realizing sooner. Another part felt something colder, a resentment he couldn't name, the prickling sense that he had been tricked. He cleared his throat and moved around the table until he stood directly in her line of sight. Her eyes shifted then, focusing on his face with a startled precision. She searched his expression as though she might read his thoughts there. He gestured at the stove, trying to find some neutral ground. "Coffee?" Her gaze dropped to his mouth, studying each shape as it formed. For a moment he thought she would answer. Instead, she bent and reached for a small leather satchel she'd set on the chair. From it, she drew a worn slate and a nub of chalk. Her hand trembled only slightly as she wrote, "I cannot hear you." The words were small and neat, as if she had practiced them many times. She held the slate out. Her eyes lifted at last to meet his fully. Elias stared at the message, something hollow opening in his chest. He knew he should feel pity, perhaps even compassion. Instead, he felt the old bitterness surge up like bile. "You should have told me," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew she could not catch them. She only watched him, her face calm, though a flush crept up her throat. She erased the slate with the side of her hand and wrote again. "Pastor Morton knew. He thought you would refuse if he told you." Elias laughed, a rough, humorless sound that startled even himself. He rubbed a hand over his mouth and turned away. The fire was nearly out. He stirred the embers with the poker, though the motion was pointless. He did not know how to look at her, how to reconcile the quiet woman before him with the enormity of what had just been laid bare. He could feel the shape of his own resentment gathering like a storm. When he turned back, she was still holding the slate, but her eyes had dropped to the floor. She looked smaller than she had the night before, as if confession had shrunk her. For a moment he almost reached out, to touch her hand, to offer something like understanding, but his pride closed his fingers into a fist. He swallowed the words he would have said, and when she looked up again, his face was set in a line he knew she could read as clearly as any slate. "This is not what I agreed to." They moved through the next days like two ghosts haunting the same ruin. Elias rose before dawn to tend the animals, and returned at dusk to find Marabel always in some quiet corner of the house, darning an old quilt, washing the same handful of dishes, folding and refolding a stack of linens that had never been used. She drifted through the rooms without sound, so that more than once he turned and found her standing there, hands pressed together, eyes steady on him. Each time he felt the same uneasy twist in his chest, part guilt, part irritation, part something he didn't have the courage to name. When he tried to speak, she watched his mouth carefully, but it was clear she could not catch more than fragments. He began to leave notes on the kitchen table in the mornings, terse lines about chores or supplies. She responded in the same way, her script small and formal. "I will mend the fence today. The stove needs more wood. I have swept the loft." Their communication became a ledger of tasks, a record of their mutual obligation. Nothing more. One afternoon he came in from the pasture, coat crusted with frost, and found her by the stove, struggling to lift the kettle. It was too heavy, and when she tried to tip it toward the basin, scalding water splashed onto her wrist. She made no sound, not even a gasp, but he saw her eyes widen, her breath catch. He crossed the kitchen before he had time to think, taking the kettle from her hands. "You'll burn yourself," he snapped, though he knew she could not hear the words. She stared up at him, lips parted in what might have been an apology or simply surprise. He set the kettle down hard enough that it sloshed over the side again, hissing against the stove's iron top. "Damn it," he muttered, pressing the heel of his hand to his forehead. When he looked at her again, her eyes had dropped to the floor, the burn on her wrist already pinking under her pale skin. He reached for her hand before he could think better of it, turning it over gently. She let him, though she did not look up. Her fingers were cold, the knuckles fine-boned and narrow. He felt the tremor running through them, and realized with a dull ache that she was afraid of him. Wordless, he guided her to the chair by the stove and pulled a clean cloth from the shelf. He wrapped it around her wrist as carefully as if she were made of something fragile. Glass, perhaps, or the last piece of faith he hadn't yet broken. When he was finished, he met her eyes. For the first time since she had come into his house, he allowed her to see the exhaustion there. She studied him, her gaze steady and without accusation. He opened his mouth to say he was sorry, that he hadn't known, that none of this was her fault, but the words failed. He let them die in the quiet. That night, he left the kitchen lantern burning. He told himself it was so she could find her way to the stove if she woke in the dark, but in truth, he could not bear the thought of her stumbling through the cold alone. The next morning, he found a note folded neatly on the table, written in the same careful hand. I did not mean deception. I did not wish to be a burden. Beneath it, in smaller letters, almost an afterthought, I can leave if you wish. He read it twice, his throat tight. The idea that she would simply walk out into the cold rather than stay unwanted settled in his chest like a stone. He did not write a reply. Instead, he left the note where it lay and went out into the snow, the door closing behind him with a dull finality that echoed in his bones long after he reached the pasture fence. The storm passed, but the cold stayed. For days the sky remained the color of old tin, and the wind scraped across the hills like a blade. Elias rose each morning to the same silence, the same brittle routine. He fed the horses, broke ice in the troughs, checked the fence line where the drifts gathered like white graves. When he came back inside, the house felt warmer but no less empty. Marabel kept to herself. She mended what could be mended, cleaned what could be cleaned. When she moved through the rooms, she did it with the wary quiet of someone expecting to be told she did not belong. Each time he saw her hands moving over some small chore, he felt the same tangle of resentment, and something softer he refused to name. He left her note untouched on the table. Part of him thought if he ignored it long enough, it might fade into the wood. Another part knew he was a coward for not answering. It was Nora Bell who finally broke the stalemate. She arrived late one afternoon, bundled in a wool cloak the color of cedar bark. Her breath clouded in front of her as she stepped onto the porch, knocking twice before pushing the door open without waiting for reply. "Elias," she called, voice bright and steady. "You alive in here?" He looked up from the chair where he'd been sitting, ledger in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in an hour. Nora's gaze flicked from him to Marabel, who stood near the stove with her hands twisted in her apron. Nora was young, no more than 20, small and quick-eyed, with a way of moving that suggested she had never learned fear. She looked from one to the other, reading the tension as easily as she read the weather. "Well," she said, shrugging off her cloak, "I brought flour and soap from the mercantile and some news." Marabel watched her lips, her expression wary. Nora noticed and smiled, stepping closer. She touched Marabel's wrist lightly to get her attention, then signed something quick and fluid with her hands. Marabel's eyes widened. A soft flush rose in her cheeks. She signed something back, slower, more hesitant. Elias felt his breath catch. He had known Nora's mother taught sign language in the mission school before she passed, but he had never seen it used, never seen words shaped in the air like that, silent but vivid as any shout. Nora nodded encouragement, replying in the same graceful motions. Marabel's shoulders eased, just enough that she looked less like she might bolt for the door. "She says she's sorry," Nora translated without looking up, "that she didn't tell you sooner. She didn't want to shame you." Elias swallowed. The ledger in his hand suddenly felt heavier than iron. "It isn't—" He stopped. The words tasted wrong, unfinished. Nora raised her brows, waiting. He set the ledger aside and rubbed a hand over his jaw. I don't know how to speak to her." "Then you learn," Nora said, her tone gentle but without pity. She signed again, and Marabel watched her hands with careful attention. The young woman turned back to Elias. "You have paper and pencil." He nodded, gesturing to the shelf. She fetched them, then crossed to the table and wrote in a quick, looping script. "I can teach you the basics, if you're willing." Marabel stood very still, her eyes on the floor. Elias saw the way her throat moved when she swallowed, the way her hands curled tight against her apron. He looked from Nora to Marabel and back again. For a long moment he felt the pull of his pride, the old reflex to retreat behind silence rather than risk the shame of trying and failing. But Nora's gaze held his, unblinking. In that steady look, he found something he hadn't felt in months, a small, stubborn flicker of hope. He drew a breath and nodded once. Nora smiled, and when she signed the next phrase, Marabel looked up, her eyes meeting his with something fragile and wondering. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was the beginning of something he could not name. The lessons began that evening. Nora stayed past sunset, her lantern throwing soft circles of light over the kitchen table as she traced each letter in the air. Marabel sat across from Elias, her hands folded tight in her lap until Nora gently guided them into motion. The first signs were simple. Yes. No. Thank you. Elias fumbled them at first, his fingers clumsy, his shoulders stiff with embarrassment. But Marabel's gaze never wavered. She watched every movement with the same patient solemnity she gave to every task. By the time Nora gathered her things to leave, the fire had burned low, and the hush between them was no longer so sharp-edged. Marabel lifted her hand in farewell, signing something slow and deliberate. Nora smiled as she translated. She says thank you for trying. Elias nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. After Nora left, Marabel remained by the table, her hands resting on the smooth wood. The lantern's glow softened the hard lines of her face, the shadows under her eyes. Elias stood near the hearth, unsure what to do with his own hands, his own heart. Finally, he picked up the pencil Nora had left and drew it across the paper in deliberate strokes. We will keep learning. She read the words and looked up, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. In the days that followed, the house changed in ways so small he might have missed them, had he not been paying attention. Marabel began leaving the door to her room ajar, a narrow line of lamplight marking her presence. She set the table with 2 plates instead of 1. She mended the tear in his coat without being asked. He, in turn, tried to learn her language. In the quiet hours before dawn, he traced the shapes of each letter, practicing until the motions felt less like imitation and more like speech. When he forgot a sign, she showed him again without reproach. Sometimes her hands would brush his as she corrected him, a feather-light contact that left his palms tingling long after. They found a rhythm, if not an understanding. Each morning he would leave her a note listing the chores he planned to do. Each evening, she would add a line in her careful script describing what she had done in his absence. The hens laid 3 eggs today. I cleaned the lamp chimneys. Thank you for fixing the fence. There were days when the old bitterness returned, when he looked at her across the table and remembered the shame of that first revelation, the way it had felt like a betrayal. But more often he found himself watching her hands, the way they moved with a grace he could never hope to match, and wondering what it would be like to hear her voice if it had survived whatever illness or accident had stolen it away. One evening, as dusk gathered itself in the corners of the room, he watched her stir a pot of stew over the fire. The light caught in her hair, turning the brown strands to gold. Without thinking, he lifted his hands and signed the word Nora had taught him only the day before. Beautiful. Marabel froze. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the soft bubbling of the stew. Then she turned to face him fully. Her eyes were wide, startled, and something he could not name flickered there, something that looked almost like fear. He felt heat rise to his cheeks, sudden and fierce. He had not meant to speak it, not yet, but he did not take it back. Marabel's hands moved, hesitant, shaping a reply he did not understand. She repeated it slower, and this time he caught the meaning. Why? The question held no accusation, only bewilderment. Elias swallowed, his heart thundering against his ribs. He did not have the words in any language, spoken or signed, to explain that it was not pity that had moved him, nor obligation, but a quiet admiration that had crept up on him like dawn. Instead, he lifted his hand again, signing as best he could. Because you are. Marabel looked down, her breath leaving her in a slow, careful exhale. When she looked up again, her eyes were shining. The thaw began early that year, though the nights still bit through wool and bone alike. Snow retreated from the pasture in patches, revealing the ragged brown earth beneath. The air smelled of mud and something sharper, the promise of green things fighting their way back to life. Elias worked longer hours as the days stretched themselves thin across the sky. He mended fence lines, cleared debris, and coaxed the stove to burn hotter than it wanted. Each evening he returned to the house to find Marabel waiting, sometimes at the kitchen table, sometimes by the window, her gaze turned toward the hills as if searching for a shape she could not name. It was on one of those evenings, when the light was failing and the shadows grew restless, that Harold Quinn arrived. Elias knew the instant he stepped onto the porch that this was no neighborly call. The knock was too sharp, too certain of its own authority. He opened the door to find a man about his own age. Though where Elias was broad and weathered, Harold was narrow and polished, his coat cut from finer cloth than most men wore this far west. His eyes were pale and cold, the color of river ice. "Evening," Harold said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I expect you know who I am." Elias did not reply. He felt Marabel's presence behind him, a stillness that pressed against his spine. "I'm here for my cousin," Harold continued, as though they were discussing livestock. "You can send her out, or I can come in and fetch her myself." A flicker of rage, hot and clean, moved through Elias's chest. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway with his body. "She's my wife," he said evenly. "You have no claim." Harold's smile was thin and sharp. "You think a scrap of paper changes the truth? She was promised to me. Her father agreed, and she knows it." He shifted his gaze past Elias, as if expecting Marabel to cower at the sound of his voice. But she did not move. When Elias glanced back, he saw her standing straight, her hands clasped tight, her chin lifted just enough that the lamplight caught the wet gleam in her eyes. Harold sighed as if this were all a tiresome inconvenience. "I don't intend to argue all night. She's coming back east with me. She can save us both some trouble by coming now." Elias felt the old bitterness rise, the part of him that wanted to believe he owed her nothing, that she had arrived unbidden, that she had burdened him with her silence and her needs. But when he looked at her face, pale but unflinching, he knew that was a lie. Without taking his eyes from Harold, he signed the word Nora had taught him for stay. Marabel did not move. Harold's lip curled. "What's this? You think you can keep her here by waving your hands around like an idiot?" Elias said nothing. He simply stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The porch boards creaked under their combined weight. For a moment, the only sound was the wind stirring in the bare branches. "You'll leave now," Elias said, his voice flat. "She doesn't belong to you." Harold's smile vanished. "You think this ends because you've played house with her for a few weeks? She'll come to her senses. She always does. She isn't leaving." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Harold leaned closer, his breath sour with travel and contempt. "She's a burden you don't understand," he said, voice dropping low. "She's broken. She always has been." Elias felt the words like a blow, but he did not step back. "Get off my land," he said. Harold straightened, his smile returning, thin and humorless. "You'll regret this." He turned and walked down the steps, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. At the edge of the yard, he paused, glancing back once. His eyes found Marabel through the window. Whatever he saw there made his mouth twist. Then he climbed onto his horse and disappeared into the growing dark. Elias stood on the porch long after the hoofbeats faded, the cold working its way through his coat into the hollow of his chest. He did not look back at Marabel. He did not trust himself to see her fear and not let it turn to anger. Only when the last light was gone did he go back inside, shutting the door on the dark. Harold did not return the next day, or the day after, but his absence felt less like a retreat than a gathering of strength. Marabel moved through the house with a watchfulness that made Elias ache. She flinched when a horse passed too near the porch, her hands tightening around whatever she held. At night, he sometimes heard her pacing behind the closed door of her room, the boards creaking in a slow, restless rhythm. Nora came often, braving the thawing roads with her quiet determination. She brought supplies and news, translating gossip Elias pretended he did not care about. Each time she arrived, Marabel's shoulders eased a fraction, as if the young woman's presence was proof the world had not turned entirely against her. One afternoon, as Nora was teaching them the signs for safe and home, the door burst open without warning. Cold air swept into the kitchen, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and horse sweat. Harold filled the doorway, his coat unbuttoned, his hair plastered to his forehead with rain. Behind him stood two men Elias did not know, broad-shouldered, their faces hidden under the brims of their hats. Nora froze, her hands half raised in mid-gesture. Marabel stepped back until she was against the far wall, her eyes wide. Elias stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "You were told to leave." Harold's smile was a thin, brittle thing. "And you were told she was coming with me." His gaze flicked to Nora. "I hear this little creature's been filling her head with foolishness." He nodded to one of the men. Without hesitation, the stranger crossed the kitchen and grabbed Nora by the arm. She gasped, the sound small and startled. "Let her go." Elias's voice was low, but it held a note he had not heard in himself in years, a depth that came from the place grief had hollowed out. Harold's smile did not change. "She'll come with me to town," he said mildly, "until your wife remembers her obligations." Marabel's hands flew up, shaping frantic signs Elias did not fully understand. Nora, her face pale, tried to answer, but the man holding her only tightened his grip. Elias moved before he could think better of it. He stepped between Marabel and Harold, planting himself so firmly that when Harold tried to take another step, he found only the immovable shape of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You'll leave the girl," Elias said, his voice raw, "and you'll get off my land." Harold's eyes glittered with something sharp. "You think you can stop me? You think she's worth this?" Elias did not look back at Marabel. He did not need to. He felt her there, a small, shaking presence behind his shoulder. For the first time since she'd entered his house, he knew without doubt that she belonged there, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because he had chosen her, and she had chosen him. "Yes," he said simply. Harold laughed, a short, ugly bark. He gestured to the second man. "Tie the girl's hands." The man moved forward, but Elias did not yield. In the narrow kitchen, there was no room to dodge, no space to negotiate. There was only the old certainty that some things were worth standing for. When the stranger reached for Nora again, Elias struck him, not with the wild desperation of a cornered man, but with the calm, deliberate force of someone who had already measured the cost. The man staggered back, hitting the table with a crash that sent the lantern skidding to the floor. Marabel cried out, a thin, wordless sound that was swallowed by the rush of blood in Elias's ears. In the confusion, Nora twisted free, scrambling toward the door. Elias moved to block Harold, but the other man was already lunging forward. A blow glanced off Elias's jaw, sharp enough to spark light behind his eyes, but he did not fall. He turned, met Harold's gaze, and saw there the brittle certainty of a man who had never been denied what he believed was his due. "You won't have her," Elias said, voice low. "Not now, not ever." Harold's lip curled. "You'll regret this." Elias did not answer. He only waited, steady as the house itself, until the three of them backed out into the yard. Nora clutched between them. The door closed with a final thud that seemed to shake the walls. Marabel sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. Elias stood over her, breathing hard, knowing that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The yard was empty by the time Elias stepped out. Snow clung to the grass in ragged patches, glinting under a dull dawn that had come without color or promise. Harold's tracks cut deep into the thawing earth, leading away toward town. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, feeling the wind crawl under his collar. He had known this would come to violence sooner or later, but knowing was not the same as being ready. When he went back inside, Marabel had risen. She wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand and looked at him, her gaze so steady it felt like a question he did not know how to answer. He signed the one word he had learned for this, shaping it carefully with his aching fingers. "Safe." Her hands lifted in reply, slower, more deliberate than he had ever seen. "Not yet." He nodded once. Then he went to the cupboard, pulled down the old rifle he had not touched since Martha died, and began to clean it. Each movement was precise, practiced. The scent of oil and iron filled the room. Marabel did not look away. Hours passed in that quiet preparation. Marabel boiled water, scrubbing the last of the blood from the floor where the stranger had fallen. She moved with the same solemn care Elias felt in his own work, as though they both understood that this was not a matter of courage, but of necessity. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened again. A storm was gathering over the hills, thick and gray as old regret. Elias checked the ammunition, his hands steady now. He had spent so long trying not to feel, not to remember, that the return of purpose, even this grim, was almost a relief. When he looked up, Marabel stood near the stove, her slate held against her chest. She waited until he met her eyes before she wrote, "I will not leave." He read it once, then again. Something shifted inside him, a slow breaking, like ice under spring water. He nodded. Just before dusk, a shape appeared at the edge of the pasture. Nora, alone, her cloak flapping in the wind like a warning flag. Elias ran to meet her, boots sinking into the softening earth. She was breathless, her hair tangled and her face scraped raw. "He's in the old mill," she gasped. "With the men. He says he'll come back tonight." Elias steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. "Did he hurt you?" Nora shook her head, but her eyes were wide, the whites stark around the irises. "He means it, Elias. He thinks she's property." He looked past her to where the clouds were dragging their dark skirts across the ridge. "Stay here," he said. "With her." Nora swallowed. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done the first night." When he stepped back into the house, Marabel turned from the window. He signed the words slowly, feeling the gravity of each shape. "I will bring her home." Her eyes filled. She did not try to stop him. Instead, she came forward and lifted her hands. Slowly, as if the gesture cost her everything she had left, she touched her fingers to his cheek. A warmth bloomed there, so sharp it almost hurt. Then she stepped back. The wind picked up as he left, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the glass. He did not look back. The path to the mill wound through bare cottonwoods, their branches clacking together like bones. He kept his rifle balanced across his shoulder, every sense sharpened by the knowledge that this was the end of pretending, the end of hoping Harold would simply vanish. When he reached the clearing, he saw the glow of lamplight seeping through the warped boards. Shadows moved inside, pacing like caged dogs. Elias breathed once, deep and steady. He thought of Martha, of the years he had spent shrinking from grief. Then he thought of Marabel, of the silent question in her eyes, the words she had written, "I will not leave." He stepped forward and knocked, the sound echoing across the cold yard like a bell summoning judgment. Inside, the shadows stilled, and when the door opened, Harold's pale eyes found his, surprised for only an instant before narrowing to slits. "You're a fool," Harold spat. "You can't win this." Elias lifted his rifle and met the man's gaze with something steadier than rage, the quiet conviction of a man who had finally remembered how to stand. "I don't have to win," he said. His voice was low but carried clear through the cold. "I only have to end it." The wind howled around them as if in agreement.